Hello, and thank you for listening. Today I'd like to read to you the first chapter of my brand new novel, The Lost Pages Bookstore. It'll be out on August 1st, 2023, available everywhere ebooks and paperbacks are sold. You can find more information about the book at my website, www.stephenewaddell.com. Thank you. I hope you enjoy. Chapter 1. The October wind flapped the collar of his coat against Donald Nelson's reddened cheek. A drop of persistent snot clung to his cold nose, threatening to fall, or worse, hang in a long string for all to see. Not that anybody would see, but still, it was embarrassing. The key to the shop was lost in the brown knit glove of his hand, and he struggled to push it away from his palm enough to get it into the tarnished old knob of the battered wood and glass door, while holding a paper bag of groceries in his other hand. A pickup drove past on Main Street, and the driver honked once. Donnie nodded without turning to look. The key slipped into the lock. He turned it and pushed the door open. Warmth and the smell of old books and fresh coffee wrapped around him, pulling him inside, promising him the protection of solitude and the ache of loneliness. Donnie closed the door and locked it behind him, making sure the close sign was still facing the street. The bookstore was dim, lit only by the orange salt lamps in the back corners and the iron-gray light of the overcast morning pressing against the front windows. He made his way down the long aisle of romance fiction to the quartet of worn red Queen Anne armchairs, crouched like tired gargoyles around a chipped and scarred faux oak coffee table. He put his brown paper bag down on the table, pulled off his gloves, and dropped them beside the bag. Next, he went to a shelf mounted on the wall and poured strong black coffee from the Mr. Coffee machine into his wide mug that still showed a few lines of the Shakespearean insults someone found funny when she bought him the cup in a different lifetime. Sitting down, Donnie looked at the bag. Inside was a dozen eggs, a pound of bacon, and a loaf of bread that hadn't molded yet. He'd awakened wanting a bacon and egg sandwich. The half loaf of bread he owned had turned green and fuzzy. There were no eggs and no bacon in his refrigerator. The cold walk to a little convenience store bait shop had sapped his energy. The idea of hot eggs and bacon on toasted bread sounded good, but the thought of standing at the two-burner hot plate in the back room of his bookstore to cook the stuff just seemed like too much work. He reached into the bag and took out the box of generic chocolate toaster pastries and tore open a silver package. He knew this was how it would turn out. He scolded himself for not at least springing for real brand-name Pop-Tarts. The pastry was dry, chalky, and cold. Why had he even bought these? It was like admitting he wouldn't cook before he even paid for the groceries. He swallowed and sipped coffee and listened to the silence between the ticks of a brass clock mounted near the cash register at the front of the store. His pastries finished, Donnie took the eggs and bacon to his mini fridge and put the bread in one of the stacked plastic crates he called a pantry. He refilled his coffee and went to the front of the store to his worn black leather desk chair behind the counter. The imprint in the seat cushion was a lover's caress as he settled into the chair and gently swiveled back and forth while looking out the dirty windows at the mostly empty street. There were a few pickups parked at the end of the block. They belonged to some of the older farmers who came into town to enjoy breakfast and fellowship at Annie's Cafe. They would be there in their faded overalls, plaid flannel or denim shirts, most with bald heads and thick guts, dirty work boots, but smiles and twinkling eyes, toothpicks dangling from the corners of their mouths, as they told old stories or commented on politics or the early cold spell. Donnie sighed and wished for a moment he could go join the conversation. It wasn't that the farmers would shun him. They simply didn't understand him and therefore didn't have much use for him. He was strange, an outsider to their profession, their way of life, and, despite living in the little town of Sagebrush, Oklahoma for over 7 years, Donnie Nelson was an outsider, a city boy who had moved here for reasons no one understood, and he was too damn closed-mouthed about his past for most people's liking. He sipped his coffee and watched tiny snowflakes beat themselves against the thick glass of the window. The snow wouldn't stick, he knew that. This cold front, the first of the season, came on the heels of mild weather. The ground was still warm. The snow would melt on contact without leaving so much as a whisper of white. Later, though, in late November or early December, northwest Oklahoma was sure to get a real snowstorm sliding down from the peaks of the Rocky Mountains. At 10 o'clock, Donnie got up and unlocked the front door and turned the hanging sign around so it said open. He turned on the overhead lights and went back to his desk chair and switched on his outdated laptop, waiting for it to boot up. When it did, he opened his word processing program, opened a file named WIP, and stared at the unfinished sentence on page 33 of the manuscript. The pain he felt. What about that pain? How did it feel? How did it affect his barbarian warrior main character? Would it melt him to a puddle of muscle and tears, or harden him into a rage-fueled instrument of vengeance? Donnie didn't know. For 7 years, he'd opened his laptop, opened the file that wasn't really a work in progress, and read that last sentence fragment. The fan mail forwarded from his agent had stopped coming years ago. Email from the more enterprising fans no longer interrupted the deluge of spam in his inbox. The movie deal fell apart, thankfully after the generous option had been paid, and the muscular star that had been in talks to play the lead had disappeared from the public eye, along with Bolkar himself. Things run in cycles, Donnie. Gene Atkins, his agent, had told him the last time they talked a few years ago. George R.R. Martin is where you should be. HBO and Netflix with all that streaming shit would eat up your Bolkar stories. Everybody's looking for the next Game of Thrones or The Witcher. They need something to remind them about Bolkar. When are you going to finish the next fucking book? They had both known it was a lie when Donnie promised he would finish it soon. Bolkar, the death merchant, was frozen in time, waiting for... Donnie didn't know what his character was waiting for. He left the laptop open and picked up the paperback mystery novel he'd begun reading late yesterday. He had taken a liking to mystery novels since moving to Sagebrush. Agatha Christie was his favorite. Shit actually gets solved in her stories, he told himself. At 12:13 p.m., the front door opened and Sherry Brown came in with the cold wind clinging to her like angry gremlins. She closed the door behind her and turned to face Donnie, a smile on her jowly face. She lowered the hood on her gray wool coat, revealing an equally gray short crop of old lady hair. Her Dillard's perfume drifted through the store and tickled Donnie's nose. "It's so cold out there," she exclaimed. "Sure is," Donnie agreed. "I guess it's lunchtime, huh?" "It is," Mrs. Brown said. "I baked cookies last night. I brought you some." From one deep pocket of her coat, she pulled a baggie of chocolate chip cookies. From the other, she removed the romance novel she'd taken yesterday. She extended the bag of cookies. "Shall I just reshelf this myself?" she asked. "That'd be great," Donnie said, taking the bag. He opened it and held it to his nose and sniffed deeply. The aroma was semi-sweet chocolate and moist cookie dough and heaven. "They smell perfect," he said. Mrs. Brown's face crinkled into a wide grin that made her eyes tiny brown and white pricks of light above her rouge. "I hope you like them. Edgar did." "I bet he did," Donnie said, thinking how Mr. Brown's pickup had been at Annie's Cafe earlier and wondering why he didn't eat breakfast with his wife. "How was the book?" Mrs. Brown looked at the paperback in her hand. It was okay. A Viking fighting a werewolf or a woman I couldn't really make myself like very much." Donnie took a cookie from a bag. He smiled at Mrs. Brown. "You win some, you lose some. With you, at least it isn't a huge investment of time." It was true. Sherry Brown borrowed a book from the store every day. At first, Donnie had charged her and given her the usual low price when she returned the previous day's book, but when she'd begun bringing him cookies, slices of cake or pie, or covered plates of chicken and dumplings, roast beef, or other complete meals, they'd made an arrangement that allowed the bank secretary to borrow a book a day every day. She never dog-eared a page. The one time she'd spilled tea on a book, she'd apologized profusely and paid for the copy. "I'm in the mood for something more contemporary today," she said, as she made her way to the romance section of the store. "There's coffee in the back if you're interested," Donnie called, then popped a moist, chocolatey cookie into his mouth. If his mouth could have an orgasm, it would be screaming the name of the Lord right now, he thought as he chewed. Even his mother hadn't made cookies this good. A few minutes and 2 cookies later, Mrs. Brown returned with 2 thin paperbacks from Harlequin. "Which one?" she asked, putting them both on the counter. Donnie smiled and shook his head. "Take them both," he said. "One of those skinny books won't last you half a day, especially today. I bet you haven't seen 5 customers." "Only 3, she answered, laughing. "I can really take both? For this bag of cookies, I should give you a key to the store," Donnie answered. Mrs. Brown laughed and deposited the 2 novels into her coat pocket. "I don't know how you stay in business, Donnie," she said, "especially without a cat." "Every bookstore should have a resident lazy cat," Donnie said in harmony with his customer. He nodded. "I know, Mrs. Brown. I just don't like cleaning up after them." "Well, I know I won't change your mind today," she said. "I do hope this weather lets up. It's not even Halloween, and it feels like Christmas." She made for the door, then stopped and turned back to face the proprietor. "Donnie, have you eaten lunch?" "I had a sandwich just before you came in," he lied. Mrs. Brown gave him a look that said she knew he wasn't telling her the truth. She shook her head and clucked her tongue. "When you moved here, you had a little bit of a tummy on you. Now you're as lean as a scarecrow. You're not eating right. I'm cooking chicken fried steak tonight. I'll bring you some tomorrow." "You don't have to do that, Mrs. Brown." "Nonsense. You stay warm and have a good day, Donnie. With that, she opened the door to the winter gremlins and slipped out. Donnie watched her hurry across the street, holding the bottom of her coat closed around her denim-clad legs as she went. She's a good woman, some kid's favorite grandma. There were no more customers that day. At 7 o'clock, Donnie closed the laptop, locked the store, turned off the lights, and flipped the sign around to closed. In the back room of the store, he patted out some ground beef and dropped it into the little skillet of his hot plate. While it fried, he turned on the television to watch the 6 o'clock news rebroadcast out of Amarillo, Texas. Most of the talk was about the early cold snap, with a few forays into details of a shooting at some low-income apartments and a city councilman being investigated for sexual misconduct with an employee. Donnie flipped his hamburger onto a bun, squirted some mustard on it, added chips to his plate, and sat down on the singular chair at a little cafe table he'd found at an antique shop. He ate and stared at the television until the food was gone. Then he flipped idly through the channels he got with his digital antenna, but didn't find anything that caught his interest. He turned off the television. The only sound was the ticking of the clock at the front of the store and the howling wind prowling through the street and alley. The room was dark. Donnie was about to get up and turn on a light and make his way to the shower stall he'd put in where a second sink had been when he bought the shop, but the sudden, almost frightening ring of the cell phone in his pocket made him jerk in his chair. He fished the phone from his pocket, accidentally accepting the call before seeing who it was from. He put the device to his head. "Hello?" he asked. "Donnie? Donald Nelson?" a man's voice replied. "Who is this?" "Eric Francis, in Lawton. Remember?" "I remember," Donnie said. "How'd you get my number?" "It wasn't easy, but there are advantages to working for a newspaper," Eric answered. "A newspaper?" Donnie asked, his stomach clenching. "Another story about the fantasy author who disappeared?" "What do you want?" he asked. He dropped into the chair he'd just left, waiting, dreading the rest of the conversation. "I just wanted to tell you Mrs. Wilder died yesterday," the voice from the past said. "I thought you'd want to know." That's the end of Chapter 1. As you can see, Donnie leads a pretty drab life. Mrs. Wilder was his high school creative writing teacher, the one who inspired him to become a writer. He goes back home for her funeral, and while he's there, he picks up 2 unwanted guests who insist on coming home with him. Once there, they begin to turn his life upside down. I hope this has been enough to pique your interest, and that you will check out the Lost Pages bookstore, available August 1st, wherever books are sold. Thank you.